Hello guys, Anthony here, and today I want to do a video on the fourth principle, the fourth Hermetic principle, which is the principle of polarity. Basically, short quote from the Kybalion. Everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Extremes meet. All truths are but half truths. All paradoxes may be reconciled. So, like the quote says, it's the idea of understanding that everything has different poles when it comes to things like hot and cold that exist as two different poles, but with degrees within each other. Whether it's sharp and dull, whether it's love and hate, things of the same nature exist on the same pole. Whether it's courage and fear, and even things like spirit and matter. Again, which makes us think of another principle that we talked before, when its correspondences or vibration. Spirit and matter are energies that exist at different frequencies, right? So spirit and matter is of the same nature, just at different poles, different polarities. And what we understand is what the principle of polarity helps us do. Eventually, I'll talk about it. Is how it helps us understanding the reconciliation of the two, the paradoxes, and one how we might learn to apply each of those poles, each of those degrees, depending on the situation. That we cannot just stay fixed on a single pole, but understanding how the duality of things and how also to navigate them. And the thing is, it's useful to understand today because I think it would help people to not get in states of polarization like we are today, especially when to do with things like politics. And there's the popular political compass of left and right, right? The left political wing and the right political wing. So the thing is, you see, there's even this idea of polarity within our political, with our economical system, with our different aspects. And so polarized society is a sign of misapplication of the principle of reconciliation. Understanding that what happens is our consciousness stays stuck in one pole or the other, and we get a point where we get a misrepresentation of the other, or we don't see the utility of the other side, or we don't understand the principle of of of, of reconciliation, which happens when we have a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis, a new thesis, a reconciliation of two parts. As if you were to take two different worldviews, you shatter them together, and then you kind of see the the blind angles that you don't have, that you ideas, understanding why a certain person can think in a certain way, and understanding that they aren't the enemy necessarily, but they might have a good intention, bad applications, or maybe vice versa. And it allows you to understand, maybe when you have a worldview, you have an argument, understanding another person's argument, another person's worldview allows you to start shattering your own worldview, taking the pieces, see the pieces that might not fit, and then integrated pieces from another side, where you create a synthesis, right? It's the idea of learning how to be flexible, how to perceive and understanding the role of each, right? And it might not be perfectly in the middle. And the thing is, each situation might require a new synthesis, a new moving towards the room, maybe more towards one side or the other, depending on each situation, right? And cause sometimes in a there's especially on the news, there's big things that happen, events, and we're like, oh, which side is right? And often see we build our truths on half truths or on lack of nuances, right? A polarized society doesn't like nuances, doesn't like to do that work. The brain wants to stay fixed and stuck, right? Understanding that our arguments might have weaknesses, and there are pieces that are true on both sides, like not all of it, not the whole picture, but pieces. And then we start building on those, and then because we know that this is really accurate, we tend to expand this perception of, oh, it is fully true to the other pieces that might not be as strong. So we're learning how to be flexible in that sense, understanding the principle of thesis, antithesis, and the willingness to simply just, hold the other pole, to go to one side or go to the other, and just being willing to even listen. So yeah, the clashing of opposite views allows one to shatter both fragments and both frames together and piece together a final product. And it's kind of a balancing game when we learn how to be flexible to edge over one degree or another. And what we learn to do also is that in each situation is that there may be a shadow side to one pole or to a dead angle or shadow side to the other. So I want to give me more concrete examples, but first I want to talk about this verse that kind of exemplifies to me the principle of polarity really well. It's in Ecclesiastes 3, verse 1 to 8. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. So what I was talking about, the idea of synthesis, of reconciliation, it happens not only on those political left or left, but on every single one of those different poles that I've explained, right? Because what happens often is we fall into that state of imbalance when we get focused on one too much, or we edge toward one. There's the principle of pendulum, which happens when it comes to things like maybe one time a certain group of individuals, certain gender is claimed to be having oppressed a certain group, and then there's the pendulum that swings, and there's built up energy, and it swings toward the other side, where on one side might say, oh, now we want to be seen equal, the other gender wants to be seen as equal, but starts to take all of the energy of oppression that they might have been under by a certain group, and then what happens is they kind of turn into a resentment, and then it makes them flip towards the other side completely, right? And we lose this sense of balance to reach really a center point. And then there are other situations, right, that may require to go 1 degree or more. And I like this idea of somebody that's walking on this tight little rope. The idea of learning how to stay in balance. And so one of the imbalance that I've noticed, especially within Christianity, is this idea of our perception of Jesus, which is much more, well, Christianity in general, I hear often people say how it's become effeminized in a sense, and I agree. And you see it through this perception of Jesus, which is the hippie and peace-loving Jesus, or this idea of spirituality in general, which there's no concept of violence, it's love and light only. And then we can lose the other side often, which can incorporate the idea of violence too, or even of war. But sometimes in our modern, especially secular society, we tend to be safe, so we don't maybe we don't see the necessity of violence that's been present when there's been violence raids, and you could have your village raided, and you had to learn how to defend yourself, defend your family, and things like that, right? Different degrees of love where one might require actually more defensive or violent means than simply saying a good word and taking care of somebody, right? And so you see it in Jesus, who, even though he was a perfect man, he would still do things like call out and even call the religious leader whitewashed tomb, bunch of snakes. He would sometimes provoke them, and he made use of a whip to chase out people who were doing the money changers in the temple. And he would even tell his disciples to go buy swords to defend themselves, right? So there was this understanding, with a sword you can use, it's not there's this idea of maybe hurting somebody or violence, right? And so these aspect of spirituality of Yeshua, those more aggressive aspects, have been kind of eclipsed and elevated. Instead, we've elevated, which is good to elevate the peace loving side, but when it eclipses the other side, there's an imbalance that we find ourselves in. And in modernity, again, we're more generally effeminate with it. We edge towards the feminine pole. So we become unfamiliar or uncomfortable with the more brusque or violent swelling sides of Christ. And even this idea of spiritual masters that we have sometimes is only peace and love. But, you look at even Yeshua, or in other different traditions like Krishna, in the example, who I personally tend to see a lot of similarity to this concept of Christ. We'll put that for another time. While you see a more warlike aspect of him, where he requires, he demands. He doesn't demand, but he says that there's a need to actually bring about war for certain things, that there needs to be a use of violence to actually protect the weak, to stop the people in the corruption who have been doing things for too long. And that's in the Bhagavad Gita, a part of it, when it talks about it's a whole story. But eventually, what we see is this aspect in even in Yeshua, the lion and the lamb. There's a time for war and a time for peace, a time to kill and a time to heal. But it's also learning when do we use each moment. So, another quote from the Kybalion. The principle of polarity teaches the pairs of opposites may be reconciled, and that thesis and antithesis are identical in nature but different in degree, and that the universal reconciliation of opposites is effected by a recognition of that principle of polarity. So I want to use the example of violence because I think that's a perfect one, a really good one when it comes to peace and war, violence and the use of violence, of the use of healing. When is the time for both? And I learned that personally I had to let go of a certain lie, which says this: violence is never the answer, right? We can say that in a wonderful, peace-loving way. We desire peace in the world. No, violence is, we should never go to war. There should never be violence. I started to more and more disagree with that idea, because when we let go of the concept of violence, we also let go of the possibility of peace. And this is where I want to be careful, right? Because it's not advocating violence because you're angry. Sometimes by reflect, oh, suddenly I'm just gonna go attacking people. It's not violence for the sake of violence. Or even Yeshua, when he took the whip and made use of violence. First, he did it more than once, and there was a time it wasn't an emotional outburst. There was emotion, but it was controlled because he took the time to observe the situation. If you look back in scripture, he took the time, he saw what was going to happen, and then he acted, right? It was discernment. And so again, there's two types of violence, right? Even violence can exist in the pole, the negative, where it's the violent oppressor, the tyrant, but there is also the one who protects the weak, their hero and the villain in a story, right? Goku and Vegeta, right? Both Luffy and all, and his enemies. There's you see it in stories, the hero and the villain. They both make use of magic, maybe it's sword, to fight, to confront each other. There's a confrontation. Imagine one side said, "Oh no, we should never use violence." Well, what happens when evil will thrive when the just do nothing? And so the concept of violence can exist within the righteous and the unrighteous. There are two sides of the same. It's like a card in your hand, two sides, and there's the unrighteous on one side and the righteous on the other. And when you say you try to stamp away, try to suppress, try to throw away the card of violence altogether because you see the evil that's been done with the violence, you also throw away the righteous violence, the righteous anger. And so it's learning how to keep all of those cards in your hand, whether it's the use of healing or violence or peace, hot and cold. It's learning how to keep each of those cards in your hands so you can know how to use them depending on the situation. Right? Renouncing violence completely, whether through this appearance of spirituality that doesn't require any violence, that's only peace and love and light, or whether it's a renouncement of violence because of understanding the ravages in the past that have been caused by those violence, the tyrants that have used violence to suppress, or even if it's the suppression of violence through the will, intention, wish of the person who wants world peace. All of those things would end up costing you the possibility of peace itself, because the answer is not suppression but integration. Reintegration, you see, I like seeing the Shaolin monks, right? They're monks in a sense, but they also, when you think Shaolin monk, we kind of forget the monk parts, right? But we think of the fighting, kind of righteous people who have chosen the righteous path of peace, but also have understand the necessity of forging their bodies to be possibly weapons in situation. Or you see this aspect of integration through a child. I remember watching a show where I think they were exchanging mothers on both families, and one of the family there was a child who was problematic, right? And so they made the child go through martial arts course to channel that aggressivity into something useful, because he was immature in his use of violence. He just reacted on emotion. But when it comes to martial arts, sometimes some things you hear a lot of masters say is the goal is to not use violence. It's actually learning how to use every possible means to not use violence, and using violence as the last resort. It's still there, it's still a card in your hand, but it's the last resort. So it's to use a focus of energy, it's to understand the polarity, where sometimes if you want to suppress violence, you end up losing the ability of peace, right? You're in a situation, you've got somebody important behind you, and there's somebody that's aggressive, and that's, I'm gonna hurt you, I'm gonna hurt, after I've hurt you, I'm gonna beat up that person behind you. You're like, oh, you gotta make a decision. You're the wall that needs to protect that other person. Or are you gonna say, ah, brother, well, you might want to first run away, or make sure that to calm the other person, but let's say that person is 100% dedicated in hurting you. You might need to put him up, right? You need to defend yourself. Without violence, there's no self-defense. So yeah, so the polarity helps us understand how to reconcile the opposites, and how to use, depending on the time and season, which degree should we move towards. Kind of like a thermostat in your house. Depending on the time of the day and the season, you might be, when it's summer, you tend to go through the polarity of cold, to the degrees of cold more often than heat. When it's winter, you go towards the heat, right? There's no point where you say, I don't like heat, I don't want heat, right? You know the necessity of moving toward the different degrees depending on the time of the day and the season. Again, there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. And I also think about the concept of weapons, guns for self-defense. I like, especially in America, when it's not the commandments, but it's the Second Amendment, right? To right to wield to right to wield weapons. I remember having a discussion with a brother and family he didn't understand the necessity of it, right? And say, oh well, you know, and it's like, yeah, I was talking to him, and it's like I was kind of trying to elucidate the understanding of the necessity for self-defense, even if the government has bigger weapons. It's better, it's understanding that even if the necessity for bearing weapons is not to hunt, but it's in case of the negative of an unrighteous use of weapons from the government, tyrant from the government that tries to come and takes the rights of the people, can only be defended by a certain level of violence that comes from the population having weapons. Hearing stories about the lady who ran away from North Korea, who after learning about the Second Amendment said, man, I wish that our people had the right to bear arms, right? And often a lot of patterns that happens with tyrannical governments is removing the population's ability to bear weapons. And yeah, so understanding it out, the concept of violence, how it's again, this polarity is still necessary for the sake of peace, for the sake of that, when you just sometimes you try to drop away the violence, you let go of sort of the aspect of peace. So that would be another example of integration. So I guess that's about all for today. Yeah. Well, so I hope that principle was useful in understanding your side. I actually have something else. Sometimes in our lives, we tend to not like certain people who actually manifest aspects of us that we're lacking, polarities in us, degrees that we're not going to, that may be useful for us. We tend to see it in other people, and those are the part of us that we've suppressed, that we don't like. Therefore, we're not going to like other people who tend to emit that aspect. So a little hint is sometimes people that you dislike, see what part of them that you really don't like, and try to take, maybe they're using it in a negative way, in an unrighteous way, and try to see if there's a righteous way that you could actually implement it. That you're somebody who doesn't actually know how to say no. Don't impose yourself enough. You tend to be take it until you get resentful, and then you tend to be annoyed by people who can assert themselves, be so confident. Try to integrate that into you. Take that. Okay, I'm going to take that, and I'm going to become that person. You don't need to take every other aspect of that. Against synthesis, antithesis, right? You don't need to take every part of that other person, but just that quality that you say, oh, I'm actually really jealous of that person because he has that. Let me take that little piece, not the other thing, just that little piece, and integrate it into my puzzle piece, into my own puzzle. So yeah, that's about all for today, and I wish you a good day. Peace.